Shortly after midnight, the Renfrews decided to sequester themselves upstairs in their bedroom. They had barricaded the door with Elsie's heavy antique bureau. The frequent rapping at their front door was fainter now, which was a blessing, but they could still hear the occasional babble of screams echo up and down the length of Chestnut Street. The knocking was bad, but the screams were much, much worse. Craig was watching the street below from the bedroom window. He'd seen far more than he really cared to see by this point, but some kind of fatalistic, morbid curiosity was compelling him to continue watching. The street was slowly filling with people dressed for bed in their pajamas and housecoats, wrapped in bath towels, sometimes even completely naked out in the frigid cold. They were all people from the neighborhood, familiar faces. They came in twos and threes, sometimes alone, sometimes in small groups, and their feet never touched the ground. They knocked on doors, and sometimes people let them in. Their numbers steadily grew. The glow of approaching headlights lit up the street, and a weathered-looking Jeep Cherokee slowed to turn into the driveway of the house directly across from the Renfrews. Its back end fishtailing a bit in the fresh snow. Craig's breath caught in his throat. "The guy across the street just came home from work," Craig said. "He just pulled into his driveway." His voice was colorless and weak. Elsie poked an arm out from underneath the comforter and waved her hand dismissively. "They're going to get him," she murmured, and she pulled her arm back under her protective quilted shield. "Just like they probably got Darren." "You don't know that," Craig snapped. "Just because he's not answering his phone? Shit, that doesn't mean that he..." Craig trailed off. "What, that he let them in?" Elsie's words were muffled by the comforter. "Maybe he wasn't inside when it started. Did you think of that? He could have been out on the town with his roommates. He's in college, Craig. They're always going out. They don't care if it's a Tuesday night." "Shh! He's getting out of his truck." Craig pressed his forehead to the glass and held his breath. The neighbor across the street was a stocky, surly-looking guy with a shaved head. Craig had never actually spoken to the man in the entire 9 years he'd been living on Chestnut Street. All he knew about the man was that he appeared to work a steady afternoon shift. He lived alone, and he was fond of spending his Sunday afternoons blaring classic rock while detailing his Jeep in the driveway. Elsie was right. Outside of his house, the man would be helpless, easy prey. They would get him. Craig wished there was some way he could warn him, but there was no way he could do that and still manage to remain unnoticed. All he could do was watch it happen. Mr. Jeep heaved himself out of his vehicle with his lunch bag in hand and stomped up to his front step, kicking up the snow in spiteful little puffs as he went. He paused on the first step and turned to look behind him, his expression softening from its usually stony belligerence to one of shock and surprise. His lips moved back and he took a few hesitant steps forward, his cluster of keys dangling loose and forgotten in hand. Mr. Jeep's eyes widened. He dropped the lunch bag and let out a thin, piercing little screech. He wheeled around to run to his door and they came for him, 5 streaks of blurred movement that darted in from every direction. They slammed into the man and threw him to his driveway with bone-crushing force. In a blink of an eye, he was covered in a blanket of bodies, a pride of starving lions in sweatpants and nightgowns. The fiends tore off Mr. Jeep's coat and shredded his work uniform with scrambling hands, throwing ragged flaps of blue cloth to swirl and flap away in the wind. "Oh, Jesus," Craig moaned. "They got him." The attackers pressed their faces into the man's exposed flesh, and he screamed. "Stop!" Elsie whimpered. "Stop! Stop it! Stop!" It was over in seconds. The attackers levitated away from the sprawled body, like a video run in reverse, and they glided off without looking back at their victim. Mr. Jeep lay face down and crumpled in his driveway, naked save for his underwear, work boots, and a few scraps of his uniform. His skin was shockingly pale in the glow of the streetlights. Craig couldn't see any visible wounds on the body. He turned to the lump under the blankets and said, "They ripped the guy's clothes off, and they went at him. You know, like they were feeding on him, eating him. But they didn't even break the skin. Not a single scratch." "I don't want to know that," Elsie snapped. "Don't tell me anything like that, you got it? I don't want to know." They were feeding on him, but what were they eating? What did they take from him? Craig peered back outside and froze. Mr. Jeep was on his feet now, and he was looking directly up at their bedroom window. But he wasn't really on his feet exactly. Mr. Jeep was actually hovering several inches in the air, impossibly weightless and buoyant, and even though the streetlights were bright against the luminous snow cover, the man cast no shadow on the ground. None at all. Craig backed away from the window. He decided that he'd seen enough for tonight. He sat down on the bed beside Elsie and waited for the knock on his front door. Moments later it came, loud and insistent. Elsie squirmed beneath her blanket fort. Craig rubbed her back until Mr. Jeep finally gave up and wandered off. He lay with her on the bed for a while and tried to think about what they could do to save themselves. Their situation was bleak. He whispered, "Should I try the radio again? What do you think, honey?" Elsie didn't answer. Craig sighed and clicked on the little radio alarm clock on his side of the bed. An hour ago, most of the stations had been broadcasting pre-programmed blocks of music, or dead air, which was troubling. But now, most of them were blasting out an emergency broadcast message on a repeating loop. It consisted of several seconds of a high-pitched tone, followed by a robotic-sounding voice that said,
"A wave of violent civil unrest has spread across the nation. Martial law has been declared. Please stay inside and do not attempt to travel. Do not allow anyone to enter your home. Lock your doors and wait for further instruction."
"Shut it off," Elsie whimpered. "There's not going to be any further instruction. No one is coming to save us." "You can't say that." "I can. Haven't you noticed yet? The sirens?" "What are you even talking about? Jesus, Elsie, why can't you try to... Craig closed his eyes and bit down on his growing irritation at his wife's frail, washed-out fatalism. Of course she was losing hope. Why wouldn't she at this point? The entire world was falling apart around them. "The sirens. Do you hear them anymore?" Craig realized that he didn't. At some point in the last hour, the aural backdrop of emergency vehicles wailing in the distance had fallen silent. He turned the radio off. He was unsurprised to see that the missing remote for the living room TV was sitting on his nightstand, teetering on top of a pile of change. He considered going downstairs to check the news stations and decided against it. The same message was probably scrolling across the screen on every station. Why bother? "What the hell is that?" he whispered, but he already knew what it was. It was the sound of cold fingers tapping on glass. Craig looked over at the window and strangled back a shriek. Mr. Jeep was floating on the other side of the glass, his eyes glowing that hypnotic, dreadful shade of amber. A tuft of wiry pubic hair was poking out from the loose fly of his ragged boxer shorts. The shredded remains of the man's work uniform fluttered in the wind. His mouth was moving, and Craig didn't have to be a lip reader to understand what he was saying. "Let us in." Craig took in a deep, shuddering breath and forced himself to stand. He shuffled over to the window on legs like rickety stilts and dropped the blinds down. He pulled the heavy curtain panels closed. The tapping continued. Craig stumbled back to the bed and joined Elsie under the covers. They curled together in the hot, close darkness of their blanket cave and waited to see what dawn might bring. The night lasted an eternity, echoing with the sounds of a world sliding into ruin. There was the squeal of spinning tires and the jagged tinkle of breaking glass, hysterical shrieking and futile pleas for mercy. Just before dawn, the sounds of horror and strife came to an abrupt end, and the shell-shocked Renfrews both fell into a light, troubled slumber. Elsie opened her eyes just before 10 in the morning and nudged her husband awake with a soft tap of her elbow. He flinched and briefly struggled against their cocoon of bedsheets. Elsie shushed him with a finger against his lips. She peeled back the blankets and said, "I really, really have to pee." "Me too," Craig whispered. "We'll go together." They crept out of their bedroom and tiptoed down the hall to the bathroom, both of them skittish as wild horses after being barricaded upstairs for so many hours. Craig stood watch at the door while Elsie took care of business, his feet shuffling around in an urgent little gotta pee dance. He heard Elsie stifle a giggle behind him, and he found himself smiling a little too. In the light of day, it was almost possible to convince himself that the horrors of the previous evening were just a dream. It had to be a dream. The sun was shining, wasn't it? They came downstairs with Craig in the lead, an aluminum baseball bat cocked over his shoulder. Elsie followed close behind with a letter opener clutched in her hand. They did a quick sweep of the main floor, both of them flinching every time. They rounded a corner, but they were still alone in the house. Craig nodded his head towards the big double windows in the living room. "Let's have a look outside," he added. "Maybe it'll be okay," and tried not to wince at how innate that sounded. "Do you smell something burning?" He realized that he did smell something burning. The odor was faint inside the house, but it was there, acrid and sharp. It wasn't the nostalgic, mellow tang of wood smoke curling into the winter air out of a neighbor's brick chimney. This was the noxious stench of a house fire. He flung the curtains back and inhaled sharply, his mouth dropping open into a slack, shocked O of surprise. "Oh hell, come look at this!" The wind had died down overnight, and the air outside was heavy with a haze of dirty, gray-black smoke. 2 house fires were visible from the window. One was guttering out on the next street over, and the other was burning fiercely just a few houses away. The neighboring homes were heavily scorched on either side of the inferno. It would be a miracle if they didn't go up in flames as well. Further down the street, an overturned car was lying on its hood on the sidewalk. It appeared to have been flipped over by brute force. There wasn't any skid marks in the snow, no sign of the driver losing control. The driver's side door had been torn off its hinges and flung into the street. "Do I really want to see this?" Elsie asked. Craig didn't answer her. He couldn't. He was speechless. Most of the houses in view had their front doors standing wide open, including the house that was burning steadily to the ground. The open doorways looked like mouths, yawning wide to let out a despairing scream. Mr. Jeep's insulated lunch bag was still lying in his driveway. A large, shaggy-haired shepherd mix trotted across his front lawn and flipped it over with his snout, sniffing for leftovers. Finding nothing of interest in there, the dog strolled away, its body language stiff and alert. Well, so much for it all being a dream, Craig thought, and he struggled against the urge to sit on the floor and start bawling like a toddler. It was real, all right. Elsie joined him at the window. She gaped at the mayhem outside. "It's like the end of the world," she said. "Houses are burning down and there's no one left to care." "Where did they all go?" Craig waved his hand at the empty street outside. "Those people were all over the place last night. I saw dozens of them. There's no one out there now. Where are they? Basements, attics, and closets. They're hiding away from the daylight. Isn't that what Craig barked. I know what you mean, you don't have to say it. The words weren't supposed to come out as a harsh rebuke, but they did. Elsie shrank away from him. He softened his tone and tried again. I think you're right. They're not pounding on the door, so they must be hiding somewhere, waiting for sunset. It's a good time for us to get dressed and get the hell out of town, because we can't stay here tonight. Where are we going to go? Elsie ground her palms against her eyes and blinked up at him. She looked dreadfully tired. Tired and diminished. Seriously, where could we go? This is happening all over the country. Maybe the entire planet. Where the hell are we going to drive to, Craig? A deserted island? I haven't figured that out just yet, hun, and I'll admit that I don't know what it's going to be like on the roads. But I'd rather take my chances out here than... The roads are going to be a mess, she hissed. You saw what happened to that car out there. Yeah, that'll be us. We'll get stuck somewhere, and then when the sun sets, they'll come for us. They'll surround the car and rip off the doors and... Listen to me. I think we very well might be the last people left on the whole goddamn street. When the sun sets, this is where they'll all be coming, Elsie. All of them. Knocking on our doors and tapping on the windows until dawn. And they'll come back tomorrow night too. They'll come back every night until they get us. I don't know if I can face that. Can you? Elsie paled. She shrank down and hugged herself. No, God, no. At Craig's insistence, they both wore heavy boots and bundled up in layers. According to the thermometer outside the kitchen window, the temperature was hovering around -10, and if the streets were snarled in a chaotic mess of crashed and overturned vehicles, they might very well be forced to strike out on foot. He found a box and packed up a loaf of bread, some canned goods and bottles of water, the first aid kit from the bathroom, anything he could think of that might be of practical value. The box was starting to get pretty heavy by the time he was done, but Craig was a big man. He could probably carry it for a long time if he had to. Here's hoping that it doesn't come to that. Elsie tried on a brave smile, but it faltered. I'm scared to leave. I don't want to stay, but I'm scared to step outside. Craig pulled her into a tight hug. It was like embracing a mannequin. You can do this, he breathed into her ear. I'm scared too. Who wouldn't be? He pulled a knitted wool cap down snugly over her ears. She didn't look much like a woman approaching her 50th birthday. She looked like a frightened child. Which car are we taking? Mine or yours? There was a hard lump of dread stuck in Craig's throat. Now that the time had come to abandon their rabbit hole, he felt an overwhelming urge to call it all off and stay right where they were, cowering in their own house. Cowering in their own house. The street appeared to be deserted, but it wasn't safe out there. He could feel the danger in the air. It prickled the hairs on the back of his neck. Death was waiting for them on the other side of the door. Yours, she said. You drive. He fished his key fob out of his coat pocket and thumbed the unlock button. Outside, there was a muted clunk as the door lock slid open. Craig hefted the bat. I'll go out there first. He pulled back the chain. You ready? Elsie tightened her lips together and nodded. I'm ready. Can you carry the box? She hefted the box and nodded again, her mouth now just a tight little slash beneath her nose. Craig took in a deep breath. Okay, let's go. Later, while he was bleeding on the driveway, he'd remember the dog he'd seen sniffing at Mr. Jeep's lunch bag. By then, it was far too late.